You want a woman with fire in her? Something you can tame? Merrick Stroud's words would cost him everything by nightfall. On the plank platform above him, a young Apache woman strained against the rope binding her wrists, and she did not flinch from a single hand that pointed at her. She looked out over that crowd of hat brims and grabbing arms, like she was memorizing every face for the day she got to settle the debt. In the back of that crowd stood a hollowed-out ex-cavalry officer who had come to town for salt and grain, and before the sun went down he would spend every dollar he had left in the world on the one decent thing he'd done in years, a choice that would burn his barn to the ground and put a rifle in his own hands before the week was out. If you want to see whether that choice was worth it, stay with us to the end. Hit the like button, and if you're watching, drop the name of your town in the comments. Let's see how far this one travels. New Mexico Territory, the autumn of 1879. His name was Nathaniel Vance, and 6 years earlier he had worn a blue coat and burned villages under orders that still visited him some nights. Now he was a failed rancher, 60 miles from anywhere that mattered, with a herd he'd just sold off to keep from losing the land under his boots. Her name was Kaya. Her sister, barely 17, was Nita. What happened between the three of them over the next season would put a cattle baron's whole empire on trial, and it started on a platform in a town too small for a church, but plenty big enough for an auction block. Watch till the end, you will not see where this one goes. Dry Fork sat low in a bowl of hard-baked earth, the kind of town that only existed because a stage line needed somewhere to change horses. Nathaniel rode in past noon with the desert heat coming off the ground in waves, tied his horse outside the mercantile, and went looking for salt and tobacco and a drink strong enough to quiet the noise in his head. He had ridden 60 miles for supplies he could barely afford on a ranch that was 3 bad seasons from belonging to the bank, and the herd he'd sold to keep the land was the last real thing of value he owned in the world. He told himself he wasn't looking for anything else. Not trouble, not company, not a reason to feel anything he hadn't already buried. The crowd reached his ears before it reached his eyes, the crack of a whip against a post, laughter with a mean edge underneath it, and under all of it, a woman's voice. Not a scream, a refusal. He rounded the corner by the feed store and found 40 men clustered around a raised platform, and on that platform stood 2 women with their wrists bound in rope. The younger one could not have been more than 17. Thin as a fence rail, her chin held up by pure will, while her whole body trembled. Beside her stood a woman a few years past 20, a bruise darkening one cheekbone, her wrists rubbed raw, her eyes burning with something well past fear. Merrick Stroud worked the edge of that platform in a good coat and a bad grin, selling human beings like a man selling prize heifers. "Sisters," he called, and the older one's got some fight left in her. Costs more to break, but ain't that half the fun of it? A rancher near the front laughed and threw out a number. Nathaniel did not move. He stood at the back of that crowd, with his hand curling slowly around. Nothing and something that had been dead in him for 6 years turned over and opened its eyes. He had told himself, riding into Dry Fork, that he was done being the kind of man who got involved. He'd learned that lesson in the worst classroom there was a canyon in the Arizona highlands. Orders that had turned villages into ash and children into ghosts he still carried behind his eyes. He had come home from that war, half a person sold most of what he owned, trying to make a ranch pay, and settled on the belief that the only mercy left to him was staying out of other people's business. Then the older sister's eyes swept across that crowd, not pleading, not broken, just cataloging, and every rule he'd made for himself came apart at once. A heavy-set man named Pruitt, cousin to the trader Luther Voss, opened the bidding on the younger one at $100. Stroud grinned and wanted more. The numbers climbed in ugly little jumps, men calling out bids like they were buying rope or nails, and Nathaniel's own voice came out of him before he decided to use it. 450? The crowd went quiet enough to hear the wind. Stroud's eyebrows lifted as he looked Nathaniel over, the dust on his coat, the worn boots, a man who did not look like he had $450 to his name. For the young one, mister? For both of them, Pruitt barked out a laugh of disbelief, then raised his own bid. Nathaniel matched it, then went past it, and kept climbing until the number sat somewhere no rational rancher would follow, $700 on top of the $450, every cent from the herd he'd sold 2 weeks earlier, to keep the bank off his land. He didn't look at the crowd while the number left his mouth. He looked at the older sister, and for one long moment she looked back at him with no gratitude in it at all, only calculation, the look of a woman deciding exactly what kind of danger he was. Nobody talked him. Stroud, who hadn't expected the sale to cost him a buyer this committed, took the money with visible reluctance and cut the ropes himself, grumbling something about a man being welcome to more trouble than he knew what to do with. Nathaniel climbed onto that platform on legs that didn't quite feel like his own, and stood in front of 2 women who had every reason in the world to hate him on sight. Up close, the younger one, Nita, looked even smaller, a girl, trying hard to be a woman, because the world had stopped giving her a choice. Kaya stood half a step in front of her sister, chin lifted, a fast low burst of Apache aimed straight at him. Nita found her voice, soft and uncertain in English. She asks, "Why you buy us? What you want?" "I'll tell you once we're clear of this town. For now, you can ride." "I'll walk." Neither moved. He offered the horse, the canteen, his silence, and got nothing back but 2 pairs of watchful eyes. Pruitt called after them from the crowd that Nathaniel had bought himself a pair of wildcats, and hoped he knew what he was doing. Nathaniel didn't answer. He took the reins and started walking, and after a long moment the sisters climbed onto the horse together, awkward with exhaustion, and let him lead them out of Dry Fork without another word between them. The ride back took the rest of the day and half the night. He kept the pace slow. The horse was carrying double, and both women looked half-starved and sun-scorched. Twice he stopped to let them drink from his canteen, and both times Kaya kept a sharp stone gripped in one hand, the kind of stone that could open a skull if it came to that. He thought if he'd been standing where she was standing, he'd have carried the same stone. By the time they reached the valley between 2 low mesas, the sky had started to pale at its eastern edge. The place wasn't much. A modest house, a barn with a bad roof, a corral holding 2 horses and a milk cow, but it sat hidden from the road, and that had always mattered to him more than comfort. He helped the sisters down, led them inside, lit a lamp, and set bread and dried meat on the table. "Eat." He stepped back, with his hands where they could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you." Kaya stood between him and Nita, the stone still in her fist, a short, hard sentence in Apache that needed no translation. Nathaniel sat down across the room, put distance between them, and waited. "I don't want anything from you. I bought you because I couldn't stand there and watch it happen. That's the whole reason. Come first, light. I'll take you wherever your people are, whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I'll get you there." Nita's translation came in a whisper. Hope and grief crossed Kaya's face in the same instant before her answer, low and flat, worked its way into English. "Our people are scattered. Soldiers came. Many are dead. Some were taken away. We do not know where to look." The old guilt turned over in Nathaniel's chest. Familiar as a scar, he had been one of those soldiers once, a different campaign, a different year, the same ugly work. "Then stay here as long as you need. No strings on it. You're not prisoners, and you're not servants either. You're just—" He searched for the word, and settled on the only honest one, people who need somewhere to catch their breath. Kaya studied his face for a long time, hunting for the lie in it. When she didn't find one, she set the stone down on the table, slow and deliberate, like a weapon she wasn't ready to give up, but had decided for tonight not to need. Nita reached for the bread first, her eyes closing at the taste of it. Kaya watched her sister eat before allowing herself a piece, and the three of them sat in that small kitchen in a silence that wasn't trust yet, but wasn't quite war either. "I am Nita." She touched her own chest, then gestured to her sister. "This is Kaya Nathaniel Vance." Kaya's next words, translated, carried a weight of their own. "She says she will not thank you. Not yet. She will see what kind of man you are first." "Fair enough," he answered, and meant it. He gave them the main room, blankets, a pair of old pillows, and told them the door didn't lock. The horse was in the barn if either of them decided the night wasn't safe under his roof. Kaya's eyes narrowed, suspicious of an offer that free. Nita wanted to know why he'd trust two strangers not to slit his throat in the dark. "I don't, but if you wanted me dead, I expect you'd have managed it by now." He paused in the doorway to the back room, not looking at either of them. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what happened to your people. I know that doesn't buy back a single thing, but it's true." He shut the door and sat on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, listening through the wall to two women who had every reason to hate him settle onto the floor and, eventually, sleep. Sleep didn't come as easy for him, turning over the same question that would follow him the rest of that season, whether buying two strangers' freedom had been an act of decency, or just one more way to outrun the man he used to be. The first week was a quiet standoff. Kaya barely used English at all that week, and what Apache she did aim at him was sharp enough to draw blood without a translator. Nita kept her own distance, though her eyes had begun to soften around the edges by the fourth day. Nathaniel worked the ranch-mended fence, cleared brush from the ditch, and pushed neither of them toward anything. Slowly, in the small margins of the day, something began to shift. Nita started naming things around the ranch in her own language and waiting half-amused to see if he'd repeat them right. The word for water, for horse, for sky, and he never once got the accent close, which seemed to please her more than getting it right would have. Kaya watched these exchanges from a careful distance, arms crossed, saying nothing, but Nathaniel noticed she'd stopped keeping the stone anywhere near her hand. On that fourth day he came back from the irrigation line to find Kaya standing in the yard with one of his rifles cradled across her arms. He stopped where he was. She didn't point it at him, but she didn't lower it either. "You know how to use that." Nita hovered in the doorway, face gone pale, and passed along her sister's answer. "Her father taught her, before the soldiers killed him." "Good." Nathaniel kept his voice level. "Then you know if you're going to shoot me, now's about as good a time as you'll get." Kaya's eyes flashed, but the rifle didn't move. "I'm not going to stop you. You've got every right in the world. I wore the uniform. I followed the orders. I don't know if I killed your father. Wrong campaign, probably. Wrong year, but I killed somebody's brother. So if you want to settle that account right here, I won't say a word against it." Nita's voice shook as she carried the words across. Kaya's grip on the rifle tightened until her knuckles went white, and for one long breath, Nathaniel genuinely believed she might do it. Then her jaw set, the barrel lowered, and a slow stream of Apache reached her sister, who went very still, translating it. "Killing you would be too easy. You want to die, it would be a mercy, and she will not give a coward mercy he did not earn." Nathaniel let the breath go that he hadn't known he was holding. "Fair enough" was fast becoming the only honest thing he seemed to know how to say to her. Kaya set the rifle back in the rack without another word and walked past him into the house. That night, for the first time, both sisters sat at his table for supper instead of eating in the corner. Nobody talked much, nobody hid either. It was a start, and starts, Nathaniel had learned the hard way, were the only currency that mattered out here. Becoming a channel member is a quick way to help keep stories like this one coming. Tap the join button right beside the channel name. It costs less than a coffee, and it means more than you'd think. Trouble arrived 2 days later without a single torch. It came with a badge. Deputy Silas Perdue rode up with 2 hired men trailing him, a weasel-faced fixture of the territorial marshal's office who did most of his real business for whoever paid better. He tipped his hat at Nathaniel, with a politeness built entirely out of mockery. "Afternoon, Vance. Heard you made quite a purchase in Dry Fork. State your business, just checking in." His smile stayed thin. "Folks are concerned about you harboring Apaches out here, times being what they are. They're free to leave whenever they choose. I've told them so myself that so." His gaze slid to the house where Kell had come to stand in the doorway, arms crossed. "Thing is, there's talk you bought those women for purposes that ain't exactly decent. Marshal wants everything on the level. Bring 'em into town, let me ask a few questions. They're not going anywhere with you. Now that sounds like a man keeping 2 women against their will. That sounds like you twisting words that were plain the first time." Perdue's smile faded into something colder. One of the hired men shifted, a hand drifting toward his gun, until Perdue's raised palm stilled him. "All right, we'll go, but this ain't finished, Vance. You keep him out here, you're gonna have problems that don't wear a badge." He wheeled his horse and rode off in a cloud of dust, and Nathaniel stood in the yard with his heart hammering long after the hoofbeats had faded. Kaya was watching him from the porch when he turned back, her expression unreadable. "They will return, I know. Then why do you not simply give us to them?" Nathaniel held her gaze across the yard. "Because I would rather die than do that." Kaya searched his face a long moment for the lie, the way she'd searched it that first night, then went back inside without another word. 2 days later, exactly as promised, they returned, and this time Perdue wasn't riding alone. Marshal Tobias Lowe came at the head of a dozen armed men, broad-shouldered, granite-faced, wearing his authority like a second skin. He dismounted and stopped 10 feet shy of the porch. "Nathaniel Vance, I'm Marshal Lowe. I expect you know why I'm here." "I can guess. I've had reports you're harboring 2 Apache women against their will. I need to speak with them myself. Verify they're here by choice. That's all this is." Nathaniel weighed it and didn't love any of the options in front of him. Lowe wasn't Perdue. He wouldn't back down, and he had the numbers to make good on it if things went sideways. You can talk to them, just you. Everyone else stays out here. Inside, Kaya and Nita stood by the table, faces guarded, as the marshal asked his plain questions. "Are you here against your will? Has he threatened you? Has he hurt you?" Nita answered first steady. When it came Kaya's turn, she softened not one word of it. "He bought us." Yes, her English needed no translator at all. But he did not keep us. He said we could leave. We chose to stay. Marshal Lowe studied her a long moment, nodded once, and settled his hat back on his head on the way out. "That's all I need. I'll make sure the concerned parties hear it from me directly." At the porch steps, he paused, quieter. "You've made yourself some enemies out here, son. Watch your back." Then he rode off, Perdue trailing behind him, wearing a look that promised the matter was far from settled. It wasn't. Perdue's promise came due. 4 nights later, and it didn't knock. Nathaniel woke to breaking glass and smoke already thick in the air, on his feet with the shotgun in his hands before he'd finished waking. Through the window 3 men stood in the yard, one of them swinging a torch toward the barn roof. The dry timber caught immediately, orange light climbing into the dark. Kaya was already at the door. "The horses?" She didn't wait for an answer, out into the yard before he could stop her, and he had no choice but to follow, both of them running headlong toward a barn already half fire. The men outside shouted and fired a shot that went wide near his boots, and he didn't stop moving. Inside, the horses screamed and reared against the smoke. Kaya went for one stall while he fought the latch on the other, eyes streaming, lungs full of ash. They got both animals loose and running, just as a section of roof gave way behind them, stumbling out together, coughing, as the barn collapsed into a column of sparks against the black sky. One of the men pointed at Kell and threw out something crude that put a red edge on Nathaniel's vision. He raised the shotgun and fired into the air, and the laughter died on the spot. "Get off my land!" His voice didn't shake. The three backed toward their horses, still muttering threats, and rode off into the dark, leaving Nathaniel and Kell in the ruin of a barn that had taken him 3 years to build. Nita came running from the house, face white with horror. There was nothing left to say. They stood together and watched it burn to a blackened skeleton, and Nathaniel understood with the flat certainty of a man who'd seen this pattern before, that the worst of it hadn't arrived yet. He thought, standing in the drifting ash, about every fire he'd ever set with his own hands under someone else's orders, and how strange it was to stand on the other side of one now, watching something he'd built turn to smoke instead of something he'd been sent to destroy. It didn't feel like penance. It felt like the bill finally coming due on a debt he'd been pretending not to owe. Kell said nothing about any of that. She simply stood beside him in the cooling dark, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and did not move away. "They will not stop," Kell said when the sun finally rose over the ruin. "No, they won't." "Then what do we do?" He looked at her, soot on her face, sweat cutting tracks through the ash. Not one flicker of surrender left in her eyes. "We prepare." Preparation meant a trench, dug by hand over 2 brutal days, running zigzag from the house to the well so a person could move under cover if shooting started. Kell matched him shovel stroke for shovel stroke without being asked, while Nita kept watch from the porch with a rifle across her knees, holding it like her life depended on knowing how it did. They worked in near silence. Once Nathaniel paused to wipe his eyes and found Kell watching him. "You dig like a soldier." "I was a soldier. I know." She drove her shovel into the dirt and leaned on the handle. "You think this hole will be enough?" "No, but it's better than nothing." That night, and the one after, nothing came. Then, on the third dawn, the hour men chose when they didn't want witnesses. Nathaniel counted torches on the horizon. 7, maybe 8, moving slow and deliberate toward the house. He woke both sisters, put the shotgun in Nita's hands and sent her to the trench, and took his position at the front window beside Kell, who had already claimed the old Springfield and would not be argued out of it. "How many?" Her voice stayed level. 7, 8, hard to say." A slurred voice reached them from the dark. "Vance, send out the squaws, and maybe we let you live." A younger, meaner voice followed. 10 seconds before we burn you out, like we did your barn." "There's 8 of us and 1 of you," laughed the man with a rope coiled over his shoulder. 2. Kaia's voice cut clean across the yard, and the laughter died on the spot. Nathaniel fired first, and the man with the rope went down, clutching his leg. The rest scattered for cover, torches dropping, and the yard plunged into gunfire and shadow. Kell worked the bolt on the old Springfield with a steadiness that unsettled even him, firing and reloading, her face gone still and focused in a way that had nothing left of fear in it. It felt like hours. It was minutes. When it stopped, the attackers were dragging their wounded back into the desert, and Nathaniel lowered the rifle with his hands shaking from the flood of adrenaline leaving his body. "We won tonight," he told Nita when she climbed out of the trench, pale but unhurt. Kaya's answer came flat and certain. "They'll come back with more," and she was right, and both of them knew it. Food was running low, ammunition lower, and there was only one place left to turn. A name surfaced in Nathaniel's memory that hadn't come up in 6 years, a man he'd served beside for 3 brutal seasons of war, who'd once pulled him out of a burning supply wagon and never mentioned it again. Josiah Kell ran a freight outfit 2 days' ride away in a town called Silver Bend, and if there was one soul left in the territory who'd ride into another man's war without asking too many questions first, it was him. Kaya's jaw set. They watch this road. If you leave alone, they will follow and kill you before you reach the next ridge. I don't see another option that ends any different. There wasn't time to argue further. Nathaniel rode out that night, keeping to the old game trails, doubling back twice when riders passed behind him in the dark. He reached Silver Bend late the following afternoon, dust-caked and half-dead on his feet, and found Josiah Kell exactly where memory had left him, behind a cluttered desk, gray creeping into his hair, the same steady eyes. Kell heard the whole account without interrupting. The auction, the sisters, the burned barn, the firefight, his face darkening with every detail. You've stepped in a hell of a mess, old friend. I know it. That's why I'm here. Kell rubbed his jaw a long moment, then nodded. Give me an hour to round up a few men who know which end of a rifle does the work. We ride at sundown. They reached the ranch 2 days later to find it standing, but scarred, bullet holes in the walls, a corral emptied, smoke still rising thin from somewhere out back. Nathaniel's stomach dropped through the floor of him until Kaya's voice cut through the smoke and he found her and Nita alive, bruised, but standing, having held that house alone against 10 or 12 men and driven every one of them off. We had no choice, was all Kaya offered when he asked how. It was, Nathaniel thought, the truest sentence anyone had spoken to him in years. With Kell's men reinforcing the house, they turned to the harder question. Who was paying for all of it? The trail led back to Merrick Stroud, and one night Nathaniel Kell and one of Kell's hired hands slipped into Dry Fork under cover of dark and broke into Stroud's trading office looking for anything that would name the money behind the raids. In a locked drawer, Nathaniel found a leather ledger filled with Stroud's cramped handwriting, payments, names, plans for raids disguised as livestock business. One name appeared again and again through every page. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Rennick was a cattle baron who owned half the land between Dry Fork and the border, a man with enough money to buy judges and enough patience to wait out anyone who crossed him. The ledger detailed telegrams to the territorial capital, a plan to manufacture an Apache uprising and use it to justify a full roundup across the region. There was no uprising. There was only a very rich man clearing land he wanted for himself, using terrified people as the excuse. The door came open before Nathaniel finished reading. 3 of Stroud's men stood in it with guns already drawn, 6 more waiting in the street. Nathaniel, Kell, and the hired hand were bound and marched at gunpoint through the desert to Rennick's ranch, an enormous fortress of a compound patrolled by more armed men than Nathaniel cared to count. They were dragged into a barn, tied to support posts, and left to wait. Absalom Rennick arrived at midday, tall, silver-haired, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been told no. He looked Nathaniel over the way. A buyer looks over livestock. Nathaniel Vance, former cavalry officer, now a rancher, failing at ranching, and yet you've caused me a considerable amount of trouble. Good. Rennick's mouth curved without warmth. You bought 2 Apache women legally acquired and in the process of legitimate sale, and made yourself an obstacle to business ever since. I don't tolerate obstacles. So here's your choice. Sign your land over to me, swear those women fled you of their own accord, and you and your friends ride out alive. Refuse, and my men burn your ranch to the ground with everyone in it, and I take the land. Anyway, you're lying. Even you can't get away with murdering people outright. Can't I? His smile stayed thin. The marshal answers to men who answer to me. The territorial governor owes his office to my money. The federal government is 1,000 miles away and doesn't care what happens in a territory like this. You're alone, Vance. No allies. No hope. All you can do now is choose how much damage gets done. He had a pen in one hand and paper on the barn's makeshift table, and Nathaniel understood, with cold clarity, Exactly what refusing would cost. Not himself, but Kaya and Nita, waiting on a ranch with no idea he'd walk straight into a trap. Before he had to answer, the compound erupted in gunfire. One of Rennick's men burst through the door, shouting about riders coming from the east, a dozen of them, armed. Through the open barn door, chaos broke loose across the yard, men running, horses rearing, and cutting through the middle of it, hair streaming behind her like a war banner, rode Kaya, a rifle in her hands, and nothing in her eyes but purpose. Behind her came a column of Apache riders, faces set for battle, moving through Rennick's compound like they had trained for exactly this their whole lives. Rennick pressed a pistol to Nathaniel's temple. "Call her off. Tell them to stand down, or I put a bullet in your skull. You think she came for me even with a gun to his head?" Nathaniel nearly laughed. "You don't know her at all." The barn door slammed open. Kaya walked in with her rifle already level, 3 warriors at her back, and the man beside her moved faster than Rennick could track. A flash of steel, and Rennick screamed and dropped the pistol, blood streaming from his hand, a blade at his throat, before he'd finished falling backward. Kaya crossed the barn and cut Nathaniel's bonds with one clean stroke. "You came for me. You came for us first." The whole of the debt settled in 5 words. The warrior who disarmed Rennick was Selah, and he'd led what remained of Kaya and Nita's scattered people out of hiding. 2 days after Nathaniel rode for Silver Bend, drawn by word that a soldier had bought 2 sisters off an auction block. When Nathaniel failed to return, Kaya knew something had gone wrong, and Selah's warriors rode with her to find out what. Selah studied Nathaniel with an appraising, unhurried gaze. "You are the one." The soldier who turned against his own kind. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. Many try. Few finish it. You have earned our help, for as long as you need it." Rennick and Stroud were bound and loaded onto horses, and with the ledger as proof, the whole company rode 2 hard days to Silver Bend, where a federal marshal's office sat waiting for exactly the kind of evidence Nathaniel now carried in his coat. The marshal paged through the ledger in near silence, his face growing grimmer with every entry, and, by sundown, Absalom, Rennick, and Merrick Stroud were behind bars awaiting a federal circuit judge. The trial took 3 months to organize, and those 3 months rebuilt Nathaniel from the ground up, as surely as they rebuilt his barn. He, Kaya, and Nita returned to the ranch with Selah's people, 30 men, women, and children who'd survived for years by never settling anywhere long enough to be found. Selah wouldn't let it be charity. "You gave my people back their daughters," he told Nathaniel simply. "We repay debts." So the Apache hunters brought back deer. The women gathered wild plants Nathaniel had never known were edible, and slowly, unevenly, something that was not quite a ranch and not quite a village began to take shape on that land. If stories like this are worth your time, becoming a channel member is one way to say so. Tap join beside the channel name. Thank you for coming this far. Kaya worked herself raw in those weeks, up before dawn, hauling water, mending, building shelter, sleeping too little and saying less. One evening, Nathaniel found her alone by the creek, watching the water without really seeing it, and sat beside her without a word. "I killed 3 men that night," she said after a while, not looking at him. "I see their faces sometimes. I wonder if there was another way." "There wasn't. They came to murder you. You survived it." "I know that is true. It does not make the weight lighter." She threw a stone into the water and watched the rings spread. "How long for you before it grew quiet?" "I'll let you know when it happens," he admitted, and she surprised them both by laughing. Short, sharp, but real. "You are a strange man, Nathaniel Vance. You carry so much guilt, and still you keep going. Never seemed like there was another option. There is always another option. You could have walked away from all of this. From us, that wouldn't have been living. Just waiting to stop. She studied him a long moment in the fading light, then, for the first time since the auction block, reached over and took his hand. Her grip was rough with work and strong with everything she'd survived, and Nathaniel held on like it was the only steady thing left in a world that hadn't stopped shaking under him in months. The summons to testify arrived 6 weeks later. Judge Hartwell, a lean, sharp-eyed circuit judge with a reputation for fairness even Rennick's lawyers couldn't buy their way around, was holding court in Silver Bend, and Nathaniel, Kell, and Nita were all required to give evidence. Nita spent the night before terrified. What if the judge didn't believe them? What if it went the way every other appeal to the law in this territory had gone? Josiah Kell, who'd ridden out to escort them personally, promised her plainly that Hartwell wasn't that kind of man, and Nathaniel prayed he was right. Word of the trial had traveled well past Silver Bend by the time it opened. Ranchers came in from 3 counties to watch a cattle baron answer for something more than a land dispute, and more than a few of them had spent years quietly resenting Rennick's grip on the territory without ever having the nerve or the evidence to say so out loud. Judge Hartwell ran his courtroom the way Nathaniel imagined he ran the rest of his life. No theatrics tolerated, no favors extended to money or reputation. Every witness heard out in full before he'd allow a single objection to interrupt them. It was, Nathaniel thought, the first time in this territory he'd watched the law behave like it actually meant what it claimed to mean. The courthouse stayed packed for 4 straight days. Nathaniel testified first, laying out everything from the auction to the barn fire to the barrel of Rennick's pistol against his skull, holding his ground through every attempt by Rennick's lawyer to rattle him. Kell took the stand next, and Nathaniel watched her walk to that chair with her chin up and her shoulders square, exactly the way she'd stood on that platform in Dry Fork, pride catching in his chest so sharp it nearly stole his breath. She spoke in careful, halting English, Nita filling in where the words wouldn't come, and told that courtroom in full what it meant to stand on a platform while men priced her body like she was livestock, what it meant to fight for her own life against men. The room went silent when she finished. Even Rennick, watching from the defense table, looked shaken by it. Nita's testimony ran shorter but landed no less hard. The fear, the auction, the moment a stranger stepped out of a crowd and gave them a choice nobody else ever had. He gave us a choice, she finished, looking straight at Rennick. That is more than any of you ever offered. The physical evidence sealed the rest. Stroud's ledger, the telegrams to the territorial capital, testimony from Kell and his men about the raids. Rennick's expensive lawyers had no answer for a paper trail that thorough. The jury took less than 2 hours. Guilty on every count. Judge Hartwell sentenced both Rennick and Stroud to 20 years in a federal prison, and the courtroom broke into noise. Nathaniel barely heard, over the ringing in his own ears. Gaia reached over and took his hand, and the 2 words that left her carried something in them he hadn't heard from her before. Wonder. We won. But winning came with its own complications. The territorial government, embarrassed by a scandal that had reached the capital and eager to be seen making amends, announced a compensation program for Apache families harmed by the raids and the illegal sale. It was a fraction of what had been taken from any of them, but it was something. And Kaya and Nita, as the 2 women at the center of the case that had brought the whole conspiracy down, were each awarded a settlement of $4,000. Enough, the letter noted in careful legal language, to establish themselves independently, anywhere in the territory or beyond it, entirely free of any prior obligation. When it arrived, carried by a clerk visibly nervous about riding into a camp full of Apache warriors, Kell read the letter twice and handed it to Nathaniel without a word. This is enough money to go anywhere. Start fresh. Somewhere nobody knows your name. Nobody remembers the auction block. Yes? What will you do? She didn't answer right away, walking to the window to look out at the land. Scrubby, harsh, overgrazed, beautiful in a way that snuck up on a person slowly. Nita wishes to stay with Selah's people. She has found family there, and happiness. For me, she paused. For so long, I only knew how to survive. Now that I could do more than survive, I did not know, for a while, what I actually wanted. You don't have to decide today. I have decided. Kaya turned to face him fully, nothing uncertain left in her voice at all. I am not staying because I owe you a debt. I have money now. I have every choice a person could ask for. And I choose to stay here with you, because the only future I actually want is the one where I am building something beside you. Her eyes held his. Do you understand what I am telling you? Nathaniel couldn't for a long moment find any words that matched the size of what he felt. So instead he crossed the room and kissed her, clumsy and uncertain the way a first kiss always is, and when they came apart, Kaya was smiling. Not the guarded, measuring look she'd worn since the auction block, but something open and entirely real. Is that a yes? That's a yes. They married 3 weeks later under the open sky, in a ceremony that belonged entirely to Kaya's people, and not one bit to any church Nathaniel had ever set foot in. Sela officiated in both English and Apache, speaking about partnership and chosen family, and the strength it took to build something new out of what the past had tried to burn down. Nita cried and teased her sister mercilessly about how long she'd pretended not to have feelings for the man who'd bought their freedom. Josiah Kell showed up with a case of good whiskey and a grin that didn't quit all night. There was no white dress, no church bell, just 2 people and everyone who mattered to them. Standing under a wide desert sky, promising to face whatever came next together. What came next was work. Good work, the kind that builds something instead of tearing it down. Kaya's settlement and Nathaniel's savings raised a new barn, sturdier than the last, then a bunkhouse, then permanent housing for Chela's people who decided, family by family, that this valley was worth staying in. The territorial government, still eager to distance itself from the scandal, offered a grant to landowners willing to provide work and housing for displaced Apache families, and Nathaniel and Kaya applied together and were approved. Within 6 months, 15 families called that land home. Within a year, it had stopped being a ranch that happened to have Apache neighbors and had become plainly a shared community, one built by 2 peoples who had every reason to distrust each other and chose instead to build something neither of them could have built alone. It was not easy, and nobody in that valley ever pretended it was. There were arguments, misunderstandings, nights Nathaniel woke sweating from dreams of fire that had nothing to do with the barn. There were still neighboring ranchers who muttered about the arrangement and threatened to boycott anyone who did business there. But the ranch turned a profit, slowly, honestly, and Kaya proved to have a sharper head for the account books than anyone had expected, right down to Josiah Kell, who took to calling her the only honest accountant in the territory every time he visited. Nita became something like a bridge between the 2 worlds living side by side on that land, fluent enough in both languages to smooth over the disputes that inevitably came with building something this new. 2 years after the wedding, Kaya gave birth to a daughter they named after Nathaniel's mother, dark-eyed and stubborn-jawed, in exactly equal measure to both her parents. Holding her the first time, Nathaniel understood something that had eluded him since the day he rode home from the war, that he had spent years trying to punish himself into some kind of redemption, when redemption had never once been about punishment at all. It was a choice, made over and over, to build instead of destroy, to include instead of exclude, to see people as people and not as obstacles or property. It was the choice he'd made on that auction platform in Dry Fork without fully understanding it yet, and every day since had simply been the long, ordinary work of choosing it again. Nita married one of Sela's warriors 2 years later, in a celebration that ran 3 days and drew people from across the territory. Watching his sister-in-law laugh at her own wedding, radiant in a way Nathaniel had never seen on that terrified 17-year-old girl on the auction block. He understood exactly what freedom actually looked like, not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. The ability to build a whole life on your own terms, surrounded by people who had chosen you back. By then the ranch held the rhythm all its own. Harvest brought Apache drums and frontier fiddles into the same yard, and nobody seemed to notice or care how strange that combination should have sounded. The schoolhouse Kaya had pushed hardest to build filled every autumn with children who moved easily between two languages and had no patience for anyone who suggested that was unusual. Kaya kept the ledgers herself, sharp-eyed and exacting, and negotiated every trade contract personally. Nobody on that land had forgotten what it cost her to learn exactly how much a person's word was worth, and she made certain her own was never worth less than the paper it was written on. It was Kaya, more than anyone, who decided who joined the community and on what terms, and it was Kaya's name, alongside Nathaniel's, on the deed that made the arrangement legal. On an evening 10 years after the day Nathaniel stood at the back of a crowd in Dry Fork and heard a man selling human beings like livestock, he stood on the hill above the ranch and looked down at everything that had grown up out of that one decision. Children ran between cook fires, a schoolhouse where Apache and settler children studied side by side, sat quiet in the fading light. Kaya climbed the hill to join him. Slower now, her belly round with their second child, and settled against him without a word. "Do you ever regret staying?" he asked. "Instead of going somewhere easier." She stayed quiet a long moment, watching the valley below them. "When I stood on that platform, I believed my life had already ended, that there was nothing left but survival. And then a stranger chose to see me as a person instead of property, and that choice gave my whole life back to me." She turned to look at him, eyes bright in the last of the light. "So no, I do not regret one day of it. This place is hard, yes, but it is ours. We built it together, and that is worth everything it cost." Nathaniel pulled her close, careful of the child between them, and understood, watching the valley settle into its evening rhythm below, lamps lighting one by one, laughter carrying up the hillside, that this had never been a story about one man's redemption. It was a story about a woman who refused to be broken on an auction block, who forgave nothing she didn't choose to forgive, who rode in at the head of her own rescue instead of waiting for anyone to hand it to her, and who chose, in the end, exactly the life she wanted, on exactly her own terms. If this story found you tonight, subscribe for more like it, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We'll see you in the next one.